The first roar of engines split the silence over the Pacific, cutting through the pre-dawn calm like a challenge thrown directly at the heart of an empire. On the deck of the USS Hornet, 16 B-25 bombers waited, their wings trembling in the early morning breeze, engines already warm and ready. Pilots and crew hunched in their cockpits, clutching controls, listening to the rhythm of their own racing hearts. Somewhere across the horizon, Japan slept, unaware that its cities were about to be awakened by fire and defiance. Just months earlier, Pearl Harbor had shattered the illusion of safety. Battleships burned, hangars collapsed, and the cries of the fallen lingered in memory like smoke that refused to fade. Across America, fear and anger mingled in every household. The nation had been humiliated, stripped of confidence overnight. Yet amid despair, a spark of audacity was kindling, a plan so daring, so improbable, that many called it madness. That plan would take the fight directly to Tokyo. Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle, a man whose calm gaze could steady storms, paced along the carrier deck, watching crews tighten straps, check instruments, and prepare for the impossible. He understood what the world did not yet realize: this mission would be remembered not for the bombs dropped, but for courage displayed against overwhelming odds. It was a psychological strike, a message to a formidable enemy, and a symbol of American resilience. The volunteers for the mission were handpicked from hundreds of eager aviators, each one trained in precision, endurance, and improvisation. They were not naive, they knew the stakes. The B-25s were not designed for carrier takeoffs, they carried enough fuel only to reach their distant landing zones in China, leaving no room for error. Ocean lay below like a predator, miles of water that would claim anyone who faltered. And yet, despite the peril, each man accepted. Fear existed, but courage overrode it. Preparation had been grueling. Bombers were stripped of unnecessary weight and retrofitted with extra fuel tanks. Pilots practiced short takeoffs, navigational maneuvers, and simulated attacks again and again until each step became instinct. Every calculation mattered: a misjudged wind, a misread instrument, a delayed turn any could mean disaster. Even the mechanics, engineers, and strategists working behind the scenes understood the odds: success was improbable, survival uncertain. Yet they pressed on, driven by necessity and audacity. The fleet moved through the Pacific in silence. Waves glittered under the rising sun, hiding beneath their surface the tension that gripped the crew. On deck, men checked charts and instruments, rehearsing their roles for what might be the most consequential flight of their lives. Conversations were hushed, eyes often lost in thought, imagining the vast distance ahead and the cities waiting beyond the horizon. The enormity of the mission was impossible to ignore. Doolittle's calm voice cut through the hum of engines and nerves. Remember your training. Fly low, stay sharp, hit your targets, and keep going west. We can do this. We must do this. His presence was a stabilizing force, but even he could not erase the fear that had nestled deep within the crew. This was no ordinary mission, it was a gamble with survival, a wager against geography, enemy defenses, and time itself. When the order finally came, the first bomber roared down the deck, tires screeching against steel, wings catching the early light, engines screaming a challenge at the sky. One by one, the aircraft lifted, slicing the horizon, leaving behind the only safety they had known for months. Below, the Pacific stretched endlessly, a blue abyss that promised death for any mistake. Above, the sky opened, and with it, possibility, the chance to strike back, to show the world that America had not been broken. Once airborne, the bombers formed tight formations, each pilot fully aware that a single error could doom them. Doolittle's voice over the radio reminded them of the plan: reach Japan undetected, deliver the payload, and continue to China. The pilots checked fuel, altitude, and bearings, feeling every gust of wind as both threat and guide. The sun rose higher, illuminating the vast ocean and hinting at the lands ahead, lands that would soon know the roar of engines and the fall of bombs. Tokyo slept under a fragile veil of ignorance. In factories, depots, and rail lines, work continued as if nothing could ever reach them. And then, almost silently, the first bombers appeared on the horizon. Low, fast, and invisible until it was almost too late, the planes unleashed a storm of defiance over industrial and military targets. Smoke and fire erupted, painting the city in chaos and disbelief. Japanese defenses scrambled, but the audacity of the mission and the skill of the airmen allowed most to escape unscathed. Every second was a test of courage and endurance. Fuel ran low, engines strained, and navigation demanded perfection. Some crews would later crash land in China, others would bail into unknown territory. Yet the men pressed on, driven by a mission larger than survival. They were delivering hope to a country still reeling from Pearl Harbor, proving to the world and themselves that audacity could redefine limits. The Doolittle Raid was more than a bombing run, it was a declaration. America had struck back, and the message was clear: the United States could reach the heart of the enemy. The raid's success was measured not in tonnage destroyed but in courage, precision, and the psychological shock inflicted on Japan. For the first time, the myth of invincibility surrounding the Japanese homeland was shattered, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that they were vulnerable. As the bombers turned westward, heading toward China, the mission was far from over. Survival depended on every calculation, every instinct, every ounce of training. The men had faced the impossible and met it, but the Pacific was relentless, and danger lingered in every shadow. Yet the raid had already achieved its purpose, hope had returned to a battered nation, and the world had witnessed that courage and ingenuity could, even against overwhelming odds, strike terror and inspire pride. History would remember April 18, 1942, not for the damage done but for the audacity displayed. It was a daring act that redefined warfare, strategy, and morale, a story of men who faced impossible odds and dared to win. In that dawn over the Pacific, the stage was set not just for a raid, but for a turning point in a war that would decide the fate of nations. Over the heart of Japan. The early morning sky above Japan was an unbroken expanse of pale blue, deceptively calm, holding the tension of what was about to happen. Far below, cities slept, their streets quiet, unaware of the approaching storm. The 16 B-25 bombers cut through the horizon, engines screaming in defiance, each aircraft a tiny speck of American determination against the vastness of enemy territory. For the crews, every second was a mixture of fear and exhilaration. They were in uncharted territory, and there was no turning back. Colonel Doolittle, flying in the lead, kept a steady hand on the controls, eyes scanning the horizon, ears attuned to every radio call. The formation maintained low altitude, skimming over treetops, rivers, and farmland, a strategy meant to evade Japanese radar and fighter patrols. The Pacific had already tested them, but now the stakes were exponentially higher. Each mile brought them closer to Tokyo and its military and industrial heart, a target they had trained for endlessly but never truly faced. The first city appeared on the horizon: Yokohama, a sprawling hub of industry and commerce. From hundreds of feet above, the crews could see the grid of streets, the smoke from chimneys, and the early stirrings of a population oblivious to the approaching danger. Bombs were armed, instruments double-checked, and the crews braced for the moment of truth. Time slowed, every breath heavy with anticipation. Then, as Doolittle's signal came, the first bombers dove, releasing their payloads with precision. Explosions shattered the morning calm, smoke rising in thick, black columns that marked the impact of American resolve. The sound of detonations echoed across the countryside, a sudden intrusion into a world that had thought itself safe. People on the ground ran in panic, seeking shelter, witnessing the unimaginable, bombers streaking low across the sky, fire erupting in streets and factories, and a force they had never encountered before. Japanese fighter planes scrambled, but the American bombers were fast, agile, and unanticipated. The low-level approach had given them an edge, allowing most of the formation to release bombs and evade immediate interception. Flying over industrial zones, the crews were struck by the scale of what they were seeing. Factories, warehouses, and rail yards stretched for miles, the infrastructure of an empire laid bare beneath them. The destruction they wrought was significant enough to disrupt operations and, more importantly, to send a message: Japan was not invulnerable. Yet, for the aviators, there was little time to dwell on the sight. The Pacific still waited beyond the mountains, and fuel was dwindling rapidly. Each second wasted over the target was a second closer to potential disaster. Some crews encountered unexpected resistance. Anti-aircraft fire burst into the sky with loud, echoing cracks, sending flares and shrapnel into the air. Pilots swerved, gunners fired, and every maneuver demanded split-second decisions. In one bomber, a shell tore through a wing panel, forcing the crew to adapt instantly. Yet amidst the chaos, the training paid off. The men had rehearsed for contingencies, every emergency drill burned into muscle memory, and it was this preparation that allowed them to continue their run without catastrophic loss. The psychological aspect of the mission was as potent as the physical. Flying over the enemy's homeland, knowing that capture could mean death or imprisonment, weighed heavily on the crews. Yet there was also a sense of pride, a quiet satisfaction in executing a plan that few believed possible. They were small aircraft, far from support, and entirely dependent on their skill and courage. Every successful bomb drop reinforced the reality that audacity could overcome even the most intimidating odds. Doolittle himself maintained composure, issuing calm instructions over the radio, correcting formations, and offering brief encouragements. "Stay low, keep moving, and keep your eyes sharp," he reminded them. His leadership was invisible yet omnipresent, a stabilizing force that allowed crews to function under extreme stress. To the men, his confidence became a lifeline. If their leader could remain unshaken, then perhaps they could too. As the formation moved from city to city, each raid left smoke and fire in its wake. Tokyo was the final objective, the largest and most symbolically significant target. The sight of its sprawling neighborhoods, industrial complexes, and military installations was both awe-inspiring and daunting. Bombs were released in carefully calculated sequences, timed to maximize disruption and minimize risk to civilians as much as the mission allowed. Yet war is indiscriminate, and the crews had to accept the consequences of striking an enemy city. After the bombs fell, the retreat began. Every plane was low on fuel, many engines overheating from extended low-level flight. Pilots navigated by instinct, maps, and landmarks, threading their way over mountains and rivers toward the rendezvous points in China. Each mile was a delicate balance between caution and urgency. A single error could result in a crash into unforgiving terrain or open water. Crews exchanged tense words over the radio, coordinating altitude, speed, and direction, every decision critical for survival. Some bombers experienced mechanical failures. A fuel pump sputtered, an engine misfired, a wheel caught an edge on landing gear. The crews worked quickly, improvising repairs mid-flight or planning emergency landings. The sense of isolation was acute. Help was thousands of miles away, and there were no second chances. The ocean stretched endlessly to the south, and the Japanese mainland loomed to the east, a vast expanse of danger with no room for error. Despite these obstacles, the psychological impact of the raid was immediate. Japan, stunned and humiliated, began reallocating resources to defend the homeland, diverting forces from the front lines. In America, news of the raid ignited hope, a sense of pride and renewed determination. The mission had achieved more than destruction, it had altered the perception of what was possible in war, inspiring both soldiers and civilians to believe that audacity could turn the tide. As the final bombers turned westward toward China, exhaustion and relief mingled in the cockpits. The raid itself had lasted mere hours, but its significance was immeasurable. Every crew member had faced near impossible odds, witnessed the devastation of war firsthand, and survived by skill, courage, and a measure of luck. The Pacific had tested them, Japan had been struck, and the mission's psychological reverberations were only beginning. In the aftermath, stories of bravery and ingenuity circulated among the crews. Pilots recounted narrow escapes from flak, gunners detailed improbable shots that deterred enemy fighters, and navigators spoke of relying on instinct when instruments failed. Each narrative reinforced a common truth: the Doolittle Raid was a triumph of preparation, courage, and unwavering resolve, a demonstration that even the most daunting challenges could be overcome by skill and audacity. By the time the planes crossed into China, the first smoke of Tokyo had faded into memory, but the impact endured. The mission would be remembered not for tonnage alone, but for proving a point that America could strike at the heart of its enemy, that courage could transcend fear, and that even the most improbable plans could succeed. For Doolittle and his men, this flight over Japan would remain etched in memory forever: the roaring engines, the tense formations, the explosions lighting the morning sky, a testament to daring and the relentless pursuit of purpose. The raid had changed the course of the Pacific War, if not in immediate destruction, then in morale, perception, and strategy. It forced Japan to reconsider its vulnerabilities, inspired a nation under siege, and proved that audacity, preparation, and courage were as lethal as any weapon. For the men flying toward China, every mile forward was a step into survival, a continuation of a mission that had already carved its mark into history. The bombs over Tokyo. Tokyo lay quiet beneath a morning sky painted in soft gold, its streets winding like veins across the heart of an empire. Life continued in mundane rhythm, factory whistles signaled the start of shifts, merchants opened stalls, and children played in courtyards, unaware that history was about to descend from above. Then, almost silently at first, the roar of engines shattered the calm. High above, 16 B-25 bombers streaked toward the capital, low and fast, carrying the audacity of an entire nation in their wings. The men of the Doolittle Raid tightened their grips on the controls, eyes scanning for movement below, ears straining for the first sound of enemy fighters. The tension was palpable, every second over enemy territory magnified risk exponentially. Any miscalculation, a sudden gust of wind, an overlooked anti-aircraft emplacement could end a life in an instant. Yet amidst the fear was exhilaration. For the first time, these young Americans were striking the very homeland that had seemed untouchable, delivering not just explosives, but a message of defiance and resilience. Colonel Jimmy Doolittle led the formation with meticulous precision. Years of experience and a calm temperament allowed him to see patterns and predict reactions. He instructed his men to maintain strict low-altitude flight, weaving through the skyline, using the terrain and buildings as cover. Radar technology was primitive by modern standards, but the Japanese forces were vigilant. Anti-aircraft guns awaited, and fighter squadrons began to rise from hidden airfields. The Doolittle raiders had no margin for error. Every maneuver, every release of a bomb, had to be executed flawlessly. As the first bombers reached the industrial heart of Tokyo, the crews were confronted with the enormity of the city. Smoke and steam rose from factories, train yards were congested with freight, and the intricate web of streets was bustling with unsuspecting civilians. Bombs were armed and calibrated to detonate with precision, targeting military installations, oil depots, and strategic factories. The city's skyline blurred past the windows of the bombers, a surreal panorama of human ingenuity that was about to be met with American audacity. The first waves released their payloads, and the explosions transformed the cityscape. Fire erupted from warehouses and factories, shock waves shattered windows, and debris rained across streets. Alarms blared, and the streets erupted into chaos. Japanese air defenses scrambled desperately, their fighters darting into the sky in an attempt to intercept the raiders. The Americans executed evasive maneuvers, banks of turns and dives practiced over weeks of training, narrowly avoiding flak and enemy fire. The combination of surprise, speed, and audacity allowed most of the formation to remain unscathed. Gunners leaned from open ports, scanning for enemy aircraft, their fingers tight on triggers. Bombardiers checked altimeters and timing devices, their eyes flicking between the sky and instruments. Pilots maintained nerve and course, aware that one misstep could send a plane spiraling into the city below. Yet, even in the chaos, there was an eerie beauty, the sunlight reflecting off rooftops, the precise choreography of formation flight, the crackle of explosions painting a vivid, terrifying tableau against the morning sky. The psychological impact of the raid was immediate. Tokyo, thought secure and insulated, now faced the terrifying reality of foreign bombers overhead. Citizens fled streets, factory workers abandoned machinery mid-task, and military commanders struggled to coordinate a response. Panic rippled across the city like water from a stone thrown into a pond. To the Americans in the air, this was proof that their mission was succeeding. The goal was never merely destruction, it was to prove that Japan could be reached, that the empire could be struck at its heart. Each bomber faced unique challenges. Some encountered intense flak, pieces of shrapnel bouncing dangerously close to engines. Others found fighters tailing them, forcing quick dives and daring maneuvers to escape. One crew narrowly avoided catastrophe when a shell shredded part of their wing. A pilot's steady hand and rapid reflexes saved the plane from plummeting. Every crew member relied not just on skill, but on instinct honed through months of rigorous preparation. The extraordinary became routine in those tense, fleeting moments. As the final planes approached their designated targets, fuel gauges ticked ominously toward empty. The window for retreat was closing fast, and every second above Tokyo increased danger. Pilots communicated in clipped, precise terms, coordinating maneuvers and adjustments, ensuring that each aircraft had a path to safety or at least toward the open skies over China. The sense of shared purpose and mutual reliance bound the men together, their fates intertwined over a hostile city thousands of miles from home. The bombs dropped in carefully calculated sequences, explosions igniting in waves across industrial zones, power plants, and military depots. Fires spread rapidly through wooden warehouses, smoke climbing into the sky, a visible signal that America had struck at the heart of the Japanese Empire. Doolittle and his men knew the physical destruction was limited, the real victory lay in psychological warfare, in showing that Japan was vulnerable, in shattering the myth of invulnerability that had shielded its cities for decades. Once the mission over Tokyo concluded, the retreat began. Pilots adjusted altitude and speed to conserve fuel, engines whining under strain, while gunners scanned the skies for pursuing fighters. The Pacific loomed to the east, unforgiving and vast. Mountains and forests of China lay ahead, offering hope of refuge but with risks of their own. The success of the bombing run was now inseparable from the challenge of survival. Every crew would need ingenuity, courage, and sheer luck to make it to friendly territory. The raid's aftermath rippled far beyond the immediate scene. In the United States, newspapers and radio broadcasts heralded the success, bringing a surge of morale to a country still reeling from Pearl Harbor. In Japan, confusion and anger dominated, as military leaders scrambled to respond and civilians grappled with the realization that their homeland was no longer untouchable. The Doolittle Raid had achieved more than strategic objectives, it had reshaped perception, morale, and planning on both sides of the conflict. For the men in the air, the mission's intensity left indelible marks. Stories of near misses, daring escapes, and split-second decisions would be recounted for years, sometimes with humor, sometimes with solemn pride. Pilots and crews had faced extreme danger with composure, relying on training, instinct, and each other. The raids over Tokyo were a testament not only to military skill but to human resilience, ingenuity, and courage under fire. By the time the last bombers turned westward toward China, the city beneath them lay smoldering, chaos still unfolding in streets and factories. For the Doolittle Raiders, the raid had been a triumph against overwhelming odds, a mission that demonstrated the power of preparation, audacity, and sheer will. Yet the journey was not over, survival depended on every careful maneuver, every navigational choice, and every ounce of remaining fuel. As engines hummed and the sky stretched ahead, the crews reflected on the enormity of what they had accomplished. They had flown farther than anyone thought possible, struck targets considered untouchable, and returned with their honor intact. Tokyo had been reached, the message delivered, and the world would never again underestimate the courage of the United States. The bombs over Tokyo were more than explosives, they were symbols of defiance, courage, and the indomitable human spirit. They marked a turning point in the Pacific War, proving that audacity could counter fear, that preparation could overcome risk, and that a handful of brave men could strike fear into the heart of an empire. The Doolittle Raiders had etched their place in history, not just with steel and fire, but with resolve, daring, and unyielding determination. Escape and consequences. The moment the last bombs fell over Tokyo, a tense calm settled over the American crews. Their mission, daring and unprecedented, had succeeded in its audacious goal, striking the heart of Japan. Yet triumph was fleeting. Every aircraft was perilously low on fuel, engines groaning under the strain of extended flight, and the vast Pacific lay between them and safety. Ahead, the mountains and rivers of China offered the first hope of refuge, but the path was narrow, dangerous, and uncertain. Survival now demanded the same courage that had carried them over enemy cities. Colonel Doolittle maintained his lead, navigating by instinct and rough calculations. Clouds hung low over the landscape, concealing mountains and valleys, making precise navigation a challenge. Every pilot knew that misjudging altitude or terrain could mean disaster. Some bombers experienced minor mechanical failures, overheated engines, flaps stuck mid-flight, or fuel pumps sputtering under strain. Crews improvised mid-air, stabilizing aircraft as best they could while still maintaining formation. Every second counted, as fuel reserves dwindled to critical levels. The Japanese military was now alert, scrambling fighters in an attempt to intercept retreating bombers. Though most Americans flew low and fast, the threat of pursuit lingered. Anti-aircraft fire sporadically erupted from coastal defenses, forcing sudden dives and evasive maneuvers. In one plane, a wing caught flak that tore through the metal skin, jolting the aircraft violently. The pilot steadied with trembling hands, communicating terse instructions to his crew to brace for emergency landing. Moments like these blurred the line between skill and sheer luck, a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. The crews also faced natural obstacles. Mountainous terrain rose abruptly, hidden by clouds and mist, and rivers twisted like silver threads across the landscape. Navigators worked furiously, comparing maps with visual landmarks, calculating distance and direction while maintaining altitude and speed. Any error could send a bomber crashing into a forested slope or empty riverbed. Sleep-deprived and tense, the men relied on instinct honed through months of preparation. Every decision, from banking to throttling, was critical for life itself. Some aircraft had to make split-second decisions to crash land. In remote villages and rice paddies of China, crews sought flat, open spaces, praying the land could cushion their descent. Local farmers and villagers, often terrified at first, became unexpected saviors. They guided broken crews to safety, offered food, and hid them from Japanese patrols. The bonds formed in these fleeting encounters were poignant, a stark contrast to the destruction left behind over Tokyo. Humanity persisted even amidst the horrors of war. Not every crew was so fortunate. Some aircraft ran out of fuel over mountainous terrain or open fields, forcing crash landings with varying degrees of injury. Pilots and crew sustained cuts, bruises, or broken bones but survived. Others were captured almost immediately by Japanese forces, facing grim consequences. These moments were a harsh reminder that even the most daring mission carried enormous risk. The line between heroism and tragedy was razor thin. For those who survived the landings, evasion became the next test. Doolittle had planned for recovery in China, but the Japanese were now aware of the attack and launched patrols to hunt down survivors. Crews split into small groups, often traveling by foot through dense forests, mountains, and villages. They relied on local resistance networks, guides, and the goodwill of villagers willing to risk their lives to aid strangers. Every encounter, every decision, was fraught with danger, but also illuminated the courage and solidarity of ordinary people swept into extraordinary circumstances. Meanwhile, the impact of the raid rippled far beyond individual survival. The psychological effect on Japan was profound. Military leaders scrambled to bolster defenses, diverting resources from front-line operations to homeland protection. Civilians faced a terrifying new reality: the empire was vulnerable. Propaganda faltered in the face of proof, and morale suffered. Conversely, in the United States, the mission sparked immense pride. Newspapers heralded the raid as proof that America could strike anywhere, that ingenuity and courage could overcome distance and danger. The story of 16 small bombers became a symbol of resilience and audacity. Doolittle and his men faced recognition alongside the physical toll. Many were lauded as heroes, awarded medals and honors for the bravery displayed during the mission. Yet personal reflection was often tempered by grief and guilt. For crews who had lost comrades or witnessed the destruction below, the triumph of success carried the weight of lives changed forever. War demanded this duality: victory and sorrow, pride and mourning, courage and fear all intertwined. As weeks passed, some of the Doolittle raiders reunited in safety, recounting their experiences in vivid detail. Tales of near misses, quick thinking, and unexpected kindness painted a complex picture of the raid. While the operation itself lasted only hours, the consequences, physical, psychological, and strategic, were long-lasting. Crews had flown further, faster, and more dangerously than anyone had imagined possible. They had struck an enemy capital, evaded capture, survived in hostile terrain, and inspired a nation. Their actions reshaped the Pacific theater and demonstrated the extraordinary impact a few determined individuals could have in the vast machinery of war. The raid also left enduring lessons. Preparation and training proved invaluable. Meticulous planning and rigorous rehearsal allowed men to act decisively in the face of chaos. Leadership mattered. Doolittle's calm presence and clear instructions stabilized crews under extreme stress. Courage was both individual and collective. Each pilot, gunner, and navigator depended on the others, forming bonds of trust that often meant the difference between life and death. Over time, the Doolittle Raid became more than a military operation, it became a legend. The story of 16 small bombers flying over Japan, defying odds, surviving impossible conditions, and returning to safety captured the imagination of a world at war. It symbolized hope in a dark time, demonstrating that audacity and courage could make the seemingly impossible achievable. Future generations would study it not just for strategy, but for the human qualities it showcased: resilience, ingenuity, and the refusal to be cowed by fear. By the end of the mission, the landscape of war had subtly shifted. Japan diverted attention and resources to homeland defense, the United States gained renewed morale, and a handful of men proved that distance, danger, and overwhelming odds could be overcome. For those who survived, the flight over Tokyo and the treacherous journey afterward would remain etched in memory forever: the roar of engines, the flash of explosions, the hush of forests at night, the kindness of strangers, and the sheer will to endure. The Doolittle Raiders returned home as heroes, celebrated and remembered for their audacity, skill, and courage. Yet beyond medals and ceremonies lay the real legacy: the demonstration that boldness could change the course of war, that preparation could counter danger, and that the human spirit, when tested, could rise to extraordinary heights. The raid was not just a strike on enemy soil, it was a testament to daring, resilience, and the profound impact of a few determined individuals challenging impossible odds.